At 6:42 on a calm autumn morning, a man stepped out of his front door to collect the mail, and within moments he was gone. The street was quiet, the same way it had been every morning for years, and nothing about the moment suggested that anything unusual was about to unfold. A few porch lights still glowed against the fading darkness, and a newspaper rested neatly at the end of a driveway. The man walking toward the mailbox that morning was Michael Turner, a 52-year-old accountant who had lived on Oakridge Lane for nearly a decade. To the people who shared that quiet street, Michael was the type of neighbor who rarely drew attention. He kept a steady routine, greeted people with a polite nod, and spent most evenings inside his modest two-story home. Yet on that particular morning, something happened that would unsettle the entire neighborhood for years to come. Michael Turner walked down his driveway toward the mailbox, paused for only a moment, and then disappeared without leaving a single clue behind. There was no sign of a struggle, no broken object in the yard, and no message to explain where he had gone. His phone remained on the kitchen counter, his car stayed parked in the driveway, and the front door of his home stood slightly open as if he had stepped outside expecting to return within seconds. But Michael Turner never came back. The calm rhythm of Oakridge Lane continued for a few minutes after that moment, unaware that the street had just become the center of a mystery that would puzzle investigators and haunt neighbors for years. In communities like Oakridge Lane, people grow comfortable with the idea that they understand the lives unfolding just beyond their fences. They recognize familiar routines without giving them much thought. They notice the same vehicles leaving each morning, the same lights turning on at night, and the same quiet greetings exchanged between neighbors walking their dogs or collecting the mail. Michael Turner fit perfectly into that pattern. He worked long hours at a regional accounting firm located about 20 minutes away from the neighborhood. He had moved to Oakridge Lane shortly after a divorce several years earlier, choosing a quiet place where life moved at a steady pace. Most evenings, he could be seen returning home with a briefcase in one hand and a paper grocery bag in the other. He enjoyed small comforts like cooking dinner, reading financial journals, and occasionally watching baseball games late into the evening. Nothing about his lifestyle suggested danger or conflict. When neighbors later tried to recall anything unusual about Michael, most struggled to think of a single detail that stood out. He was simply the quiet man who lived halfway down the street, the one who followed the same morning routine day after day without interruption. That routine began each morning at exactly the same time. He woke shortly after 6, brewed a cup of coffee, skimmed the front page of the newspaper, and then stepped outside to check the mailbox before getting ready for work. It was a simple habit repeated hundreds of times over the years. On the morning he disappeared, everything began exactly the same way. Across the street from Michael's house lived a woman named Janet Collins, who had spent nearly 20 years in the neighborhood and knew the small details of daily life better than most residents. Janet often woke early to prepare breakfast before leaving for her job at a nearby medical clinic. That morning, as she stood near her kitchen window pouring coffee into a mug, she happened to glance outside and saw Michael Turner walking down his driveway, just as he always did. There was nothing remarkable about the moment. The sun had only begun to rise, casting long shadows across the pavement. A cool breeze moved through the trees, carrying the quiet sounds of a waking neighborhood. Janet watched absent-mindedly for a moment as Michael reached the mailbox. She turned away from the window to place her coffee on the table, thinking nothing more of it. But when she glanced back outside only seconds later, Michael was gone. At first, the details seemed so ordinary that her mind barely registered it. She assumed he had simply returned inside the house. Yet something about the scene felt slightly strange. The mailbox door remained open, swinging gently as the breeze passed through the yard. The front door of Michael's house was still ajar. It looked as though he had stepped outside intending to return immediately, yet the driveway stood empty. Janet would later explain to investigators that the moment left her with a brief sense of confusion, but she quickly dismissed the thought and continued with her morning routine. Hours passed before anyone realized something was wrong. By late afternoon, Michael's car was still sitting in the driveway exactly where it had been that morning. The mailbox remained open, and the newspaper lay untouched on the ground beside it. Neighbors who passed by the house began to notice the unusual quiet. Michael had not gone to work that day, something that his employer would later confirm after he failed to appear at the office or answer phone calls. When Janet returned home that evening and saw that nothing had changed, She walked across the street and knocked gently on Michael's door. There was no answer. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Inside, everything looked normal. A cup of coffee sat half-finished on the table. The television remote rested neatly beside a folded newspaper. There were no signs that anyone had entered the home or taken anything away. Yet Michael Turner himself was nowhere to be found. By the following morning, a missing person report had been filed, and officers from the local police department arrived to begin asking questions throughout the neighborhood. What they discovered over the next several hours would leave them with more questions than answers. Investigators quickly determined that Michael Turner had been seen stepping outside shortly before 7 o'clock that morning, and security cameras positioned on nearby houses confirmed the same timeline. One camera captured Michael walking toward the mailbox with a coffee mug still in his hand. Another camera across the street showed him reaching the end of the driveway. But in the brief moment when a passing vehicle blocked the camera's view of the street, Michael disappeared from sight. When the vehicle moved out of frame just seconds later, the driveway was empty. No one approached him. No car stopped nearby. No figure was seen running across the street or moving through the yard. It was as if Michael Turner had simply stepped out of existence during those few seconds when the camera could not see him. For detectives who reviewed the footage again and again, the absence of evidence was almost as unsettling as the disappearance itself. Every possibility seemed to raise new questions. If someone had taken Michael by force, where were the signs of a struggle? If he had left voluntarily, why did he abandon his phone, wallet, and car inside the house? And if he had planned to leave that morning, how had he managed to vanish so completely in the middle of a quiet residential street? Before we go deeper into the mystery surrounding Michael Turner and the quiet neighborhood where he disappeared, we want to hear from you. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what investigators would soon uncover about Michael Turner's final weeks on Oakridge Lane would challenge the simple assumptions neighbors once held about the man living halfway down the street. As detectives continued speaking with residents and reviewing security footage from nearby homes, a single detail began to stand out. Just 2 houses away from Michael's home lived a man named Ryan Mitchell, a relatively new arrival who had moved into the neighborhood only a few months earlier. Unlike most residents of Oakridge Lane, Ryan kept to himself and rarely joined conversations with neighbors. Some people described him as quiet and observant, often seen sitting on his front porch late in the evening watching the street. At first, that detail seemed unimportant. But as investigators examined the timeline surrounding Michael Turner's disappearance, they began to realize that Ryan Mitchell might have been one of the few people who had a clear view of Michael's house on the morning he vanished. And if that was true, then the quiet neighbor watching from 2 houses away might have witnessed something that no one else had seen. Michael Turner was the kind of neighbor most people barely noticed. He was quiet in the way many middle-aged professionals living in suburban America tend to be, someone who blended easily into the rhythm of everyday life without drawing attention to himself. People remembered small details about him rather than big ones. They remembered that he kept his lawn trimmed neatly, that he sometimes waved politely while checking the mail, and that his porch light always turned off at exactly the same time each morning. For years, that routine made him part of the background of Oakridge Lane. The street itself sat within a modest American town where neighborhoods were built around calm sidewalks, maple trees, and the quiet expectation that nothing truly dramatic ever happened there. Families had lived on that street for decades. Children rode their bicycles in the afternoons. Retirees walked their dogs before sunset. It was the kind of place where people believed serious crime belonged somewhere else. But on October 14th, that belief was shaken by a simple moment that no one could fully explain. At 6:42 that morning, Michael Turner stepped outside his front door, carrying a cup of coffee, and walked toward his mailbox at the end of his driveway. A few seconds later, he was gone, and in the days that followed, investigators would begin asking a question that echoed through the entire community. How could a man disappear from the middle of his own driveway without anyone seeing what happened next? As news of Michael Turner's disappearance spread through Oakridge Lane, neighbors struggled to make sense of the event using the small pieces of information they had. Several residents recalled seeing Michael earlier that week while he was returning from work with groceries in his hands. Others remembered brief conversations about the weather or the local baseball team. None of those memories suggested a man who intended to walk away from his life. That was the first puzzle detectives faced. When adults choose to disappear intentionally, they usually leave behind signs of preparation such as packed belongings, unusual bank activity, or phone calls hinting at personal trouble. In Michael's case, investigators found none of those indicators. His bank account showed ordinary spending patterns. His work computer contained unfinished files from the previous evening. Even the refrigerator inside his home was stocked with groceries he had purchased only 2 days earlier. Everything about his life suggested that he expected to wake up the next morning and continue exactly where he left off. That made the security footage of his final moments even more confusing. The cameras clearly showed him leaving his front door at 6:42 in the morning and walking calmly toward the mailbox, just as he had done hundreds of times before. After that brief moment, however, the trail ended abruptly. No one saw him return inside the house. No vehicle was captured stopping nearby. The quiet suburban street simply continued its morning routine while Michael Turner vanished from view. Neighbors who spoke with investigators described the disappearance as something that felt deeply out of place for the neighborhood. Janet Collins, the woman who had looked out her kitchen window that morning, repeated the same sentence several times while answering questions from detectives. She told them that Michael Turner was not the kind of man people expected to vanish. He was steady, organized, and careful about the details of daily life. She recalled that he once returned a misplaced package to her porch even though it would have been easy for him to ignore the mistake. Another neighbor mentioned that Michael had helped shovel snow from a driveway during the previous winter without being asked. These small acts made the situation harder for residents to understand. When a person with a chaotic life disappears, people can usually imagine the reasons behind it. But when a man known for quiet discipline vanishes between the front door and the mailbox, the mystery becomes far more unsettling. Investigators began asking questions that seemed almost impossible to answer. Did Michael Turner decide to leave his life behind without telling anyone? Was he taken by someone who knew his routine well enough to strike at exactly the right moment? Or could the answer be even closer than anyone expected, hidden within the familiar faces of the people living just a few houses away? As detectives continued examining the timeline surrounding October 14th, they began focusing on the layout of Oakridge Lane itself. The street curved gently through the neighborhood, with houses positioned close enough that residents could easily see activity in nearby driveways. Several homes had security cameras installed above their garages, providing partial views of the road and surrounding yards. Investigators collected footage from every camera they could find, hoping one of them might reveal a small detail that had been missed earlier. Hours of recordings showed the same calm morning repeated from different angles. A jogger passed by shortly before sunrise. A delivery truck drove slowly down the street about 15 minutes after Michael stepped outside. But none of the recordings captured any clear explanation for where he went. Instead, the footage created an even deeper puzzle. The timeline suggested that Michael Turner disappeared during a narrow window of time that lasted only a few seconds. In a quiet residential neighborhood where several houses faced the street, that seemed almost impossible. Someone should have seen something unusual. Someone should have noticed a stranger walking nearby or a vehicle slowing down at the curb. Yet every neighbor investigators interviewed offered the same answer. They had seen nothing that morning that seemed out of place. The longer detectives studied the street and the routines of the people living there, the more they realized that the answer might lie hidden within the ordinary details of neighborhood life. When investigators mapped out the positions of each house and compared them with the security camera footage, one location stood out immediately. 2 houses away from Michael Turner lived Ryan Mitchell, the quiet resident who had moved into the neighborhood only months before the disappearance. Several neighbors remembered seeing Ryan sitting on his front porch in the evenings or standing near his garage while watching the street. At the time, those habits seemed harmless. Many people enjoy sitting outside and observing the calm of their neighborhood after a long day. But when detectives examined the line of sight from Ryan Mitchell's property, they realized something significant. From the front of Ryan's house, it was possible to see nearly the entire driveway of Michael Turner's home. That meant Ryan Mitchell may have had a clearer view of Michael's morning routine than anyone else on Oakridge Lane. When officers first spoke with him, Ryan calmly explained that he had not noticed anything unusual that morning. His answer seemed straightforward, but investigators could not ignore one simple possibility. If anyone on that street had the opportunity to observe Michael Turner during the final moments before he disappeared, it was the quiet neighbor living just 2 houses away. And as detectives began to look more closely at Ryan Mitchell's life and the reasons he had moved to Oakridge Lane in the first place, they realized that this neighbor might soon become the center of a mystery that no one in the community had expected. To understand why the disappearance of Michael Turner unsettled so many people, investigators first had to understand the man himself. Michael Turner was 52 years old, an experienced accountant who had spent most of his adult life working quietly behind the scenes of other people's finances. Colleagues described him as careful with numbers and patient with details, the kind of professional who double-checked everything before signing his name to a report. He had been married for nearly 15 years before a divorce several years earlier changed the direction of his personal life. After the separation, Michael moved to Oakridge Lane, choosing a modest house in a quiet suburban neighborhood where he could begin again without drawing attention to himself. Friends from work said he rarely spoke about the divorce, preferring instead to focus on routine and stability. His life became structured around simple habits that rarely changed. He woke early each morning, brewed coffee in the same small machine on his kitchen counter, and opened the newspaper to the business section before getting ready for work. These habits may have seemed ordinary to an outside observer, but for Michael they created a sense of order that guided his days. People who knew him often said he valued consistency more than excitement, and in many ways that quiet discipline defined the way he lived. Neighbors on Oakridge Lane saw the same pattern from a distance. Michael Turner was polite when spoken to, though he rarely lingered in long conversations. He kept his yard trimmed neatly and placed his trash bins at the curb on the exact same evening each week. Residents who walked past his house in the mornings often saw the same familiar scene unfolding. The front porch light would switch off shortly after sunrise. A few minutes later, the front door would open, and Michael would step outside, holding a coffee mug while glancing briefly toward the street. Then he would walk down the driveway to the mailbox, retrieve the letters waiting inside, and return to the house without delay. That small ritual happened so consistently that several neighbors later told investigators they could almost set their clocks by it. Every morning followed the same sequence. Coffee first, newspaper second, walk to the mailbox. The time was always close to 6:40 in the morning. The reliability of that habit became one of the most important details in the investigation because it meant that anyone observing Michael Turner's life could easily predict where he would be at the start of each day. Oakridge Lane itself played a large role in why the disappearance felt so deeply unsettling. The neighborhood had developed slowly over the years, attracting families who valued quiet streets and a sense of familiarity with the people living nearby. Many residents had known each other long enough to exchange casual greetings across their lawns or gather for small barbecues during the summer months. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks while parents watched from front porches, and during the winter neighbors often helped one another shovel snow after heavy storms. Crime in the area was extremely rare, which allowed a sense of comfort to grow among the residents. Some households left their doors unlocked during the day. Others allowed packages to sit on their porches for hours without worrying that they might disappear. When people described Oakridge Lane to friends outside the community, they often spoke of it as the kind of place where nothing truly dramatic ever happened. That peaceful reputation made the sudden disappearance of Michael Turner feel even more disturbing. It was difficult for residents to accept that a man could vanish from a driveway in the middle of such a calm neighborhood without anyone seeing how it happened. As investigators continued interviewing neighbors and examining the routines of the street, they began to notice a small detail that had received little attention at first. Just next door to Michael Turner's house lived a man named Ryan Mitchell, who had moved into the neighborhood roughly 6 months before the disappearance. Ryan Mitchell's arrival had been quiet, and many residents realized afterward that they knew very little about him. He kept his lawn tidy and maintained his property carefully, but he rarely participated in the casual social gatherings that occasionally took place along the street. Neighbors described him as polite yet distant, someone who acknowledged greetings with a brief nod before returning to whatever he was doing. Several people remembered seeing Ryan sitting on his front porch in the evenings, sometimes for long periods of time, watching the street as the daylight faded. At first, those memories seemed harmless, simply the habit of a person who enjoyed the quiet of the neighborhood. But when investigators began reconstructing the final weeks before Michael Turner vanished, those observations took on a different significance. One resident who lived a few houses away recalled noticing Ryan Mitchell outside early in the mornings on several occasions. According to that neighbor, Ryan sometimes appeared to be drinking coffee while standing near the edge of his porch, facing the street where Michael Turner's driveway was clearly visible. The neighbor explained that Ryan rarely spoke during those moments and seemed focused on observing the calm routines of the neighborhood as the day began. At the time, no one thought much about it. People often watched the street while enjoying the quiet of the morning. But when detectives realized how consistent Michael Turner's routine had been, they also realized something else. Anyone living nearby would have known exactly when Michael stepped outside each day. That meant someone paying close attention to the street could easily anticipate the precise moment when he walked toward the mailbox. When investigators asked neighbors if Ryan Mitchell had ever spoken about Michael Turner, most said they could not remember a single conversation between the two men. They lived only a short distance apart, yet they seemed to occupy separate worlds within the same neighborhood. That distance raised a quiet question in the minds of detectives. How much had Ryan Mitchell actually observed from the porch of his home during those 6 months on Oakridge Lane? As the investigation moved forward, detectives reviewed every detail surrounding Ryan Mitchell's arrival in the neighborhood. Property records showed that he had purchased the house using a limited liability company rather than his own name, a choice that was unusual but not illegal. Utility accounts had been established shortly after he moved in, and neighbors confirmed that he appeared to live there alone. His daily habits were difficult to describe because few residents interacted with him long enough to notice patterns in his routine. What investigators did know was that his house sat in a position that offered a clear view of Michael Turner's driveway from several angles. From the porch, from the living room window, and even from the edge of his front yard, Ryan Mitchell could easily observe the short walk Michael made to the mailbox each morning. When detectives considered how often Michael repeated that same routine, they began to recognize a troubling possibility. 4 months before the disappearance, Ryan Mitchell may have had the opportunity to watch Michael Turner begin his day in exactly the same way. At first, there was no evidence linking Ryan Mitchell directly to the disappearance, and detectives were careful not to draw conclusions too quickly. Yet the more they studied the layout of Oakridge Lane and the habits of the people living there, the more they realized that one neighbor had likely seen more than anyone else. The calm man sitting quietly on his porch, observing the street in the early morning light, might have witnessed something that others had missed entirely. As investigators prepared to examine Ryan Mitchell's background more closely, they began to consider a possibility that made the case even more unsettling. Because if Ryan Mitchell had indeed been watching the street during those months before October 14th, then Michael Turner's routine may not have been as private as everyone once believed. And as detectives would soon discover, the quiet neighbor living next door might have been paying far closer attention to Michael Turner than anyone on Oakridge Lane had ever imagined. The morning Michael Turner disappeared began like hundreds of mornings before it. According to the digital clock inside his kitchen, the time was 6:42 when the front door opened and Michael stepped outside with a coffee mug still in his hand. The sky above Oakridge Lane was beginning to brighten with the soft light of early autumn, and the street remained quiet except for the distant sound of a car passing somewhere beyond the neighborhood. A newspaper had just landed near the edge of Michael's driveway, sliding across the pavement before coming to rest beside the curb. Inside the house, everything looked ordinary. The kitchen lights were on, the coffee maker was still warm, and the front page of the newspaper remained folded on the table where Michael had been reading moments earlier. Outside, his car sat exactly where it had been parked the night before. When Michael stepped onto the driveway that morning, nothing suggested the routine was about to end in a way that would puzzle investigators for years. Security cameras mounted on nearby homes later revealed the final confirmed moments of Michael Turner's routine. The footage showed him walking calmly down the driveway toward the mailbox with the same relaxed pace neighbors had seen many times before. He reached the end of the driveway and extended his hand toward the mailbox door. Then something unusual happened within the frame of the camera recording the scene. One of the cameras positioned across the street experienced a brief disruption in the image. The interruption lasted only a moment, just long enough for the recording to freeze and skip ahead a few seconds. When the footage resumed, the driveway where Michael had been standing seconds earlier appeared empty. The mailbox door remained open, gently moving in the morning breeze. The newspaper still rested on the ground near the curb, but Michael Turner himself was no longer visible anywhere in the frame. Investigators replayed the recording repeatedly, slowing the footage and examining every detail in the seconds leading up to the interruption. Each time they watched it, the result was the same. Michael approached the mailbox. The image froze for an instant, and when the video continued, the driveway was empty. No person appeared walking away from the scene. No vehicle pulled up beside the curb. The quiet street looked exactly the same as it had moments before, except for one important detail. Michael Turner had vanished from view in the briefest gap in the recording. For detectives accustomed to building timelines from surveillance footage, the clip was deeply frustrating. It offered confirmation of the moment Michael stepped outside, yet it revealed nothing about where he went next. When officers first entered Michael Turner's home later that day, they immediately noticed several details that made the disappearance even more puzzling. His car remained parked in the driveway with the keys still inside the house. His phone rested on the kitchen counter beside the coffee mug he had carried earlier that morning. His wallet lay on the same counter, untouched, containing his driver's license, credit cards, and cash. Nothing appeared missing from the home. The refrigerator held groceries purchased only days earlier, and the bedroom closet showed no signs that clothing or luggage had been removed. These details suggested that Michael had stepped outside expecting to return within seconds. Investigators found no evidence that he had prepared to leave the neighborhood or travel anywhere at all. Even his work computer remained open on a desk in the living room, displaying documents related to a financial report he had been preparing for his employer. Every piece of evidence inside the house pointed toward a man who planned to continue his routine that day, not abandon his life without warning. That fact made the disappearance feel even more mysterious. It was as if Michael Turner had been interrupted in the middle of his morning ritual and then removed from the scene without leaving behind the slightest trace. Within hours of receiving the missing person report, the local police department began a search of the surrounding area. Officers walked door to door along Oakridge Lane, asking residents if they had noticed anything unusual during the early morning hours. Some neighbors reported hearing a car drive past around the time Michael stepped outside, but none could describe anything that seemed connected to the disappearance. Search teams expanded the investigation beyond the street itself, examining nearby wooded areas and empty lots that bordered the neighborhood. Drone units scanned sections of land behind several houses where thick trees created narrow walking paths. Police dogs trained to track human scent were brought to the scene in hopes that they might detect the direction Michael had traveled after leaving the driveway. Yet each effort ended with the same frustrating result. The dogs followed a faint scent from the front door of Michael's house toward the mailbox and then stopped abruptly, as if the trail had ended there. The ground surrounding the driveway revealed no clear footprints leading away from the property. There were no disturbed plants or broken branches in the nearby yards. Even the soft soil near the curb showed no marks that might indicate someone had dragged or carried a person away. Investigators began to realize that the disappearance had occurred within a very narrow window of time and left almost nothing behind to explain how it happened. As the search continued over the following days, residents of Oakridge Lane watched with growing unease. Police vehicles lined the street while officers walked through backyards and examined nearby drainage areas for any possible evidence. Volunteers joined organized searches in nearby parks and wooded trails, hoping to locate even the smallest clue that might reveal where Michael Turner had gone. Yet despite the attention focused on the neighborhood, the investigation produced no clear answers. The mailbox remained the last confirmed point where Michael had been seen. The open door of his house marked the beginning of the timeline, and the empty driveway captured by security cameras marked the end. Everything that happened in between remained unknown. For detectives reviewing the case, the absence of evidence felt almost as unsettling as the disappearance itself. It suggested that whoever or whatever was responsible had left the scene with extraordinary precision. While officers continued searching the surrounding area, another team of investigators began examining the homes located along Oakridge Lane more closely. They collected security footage from every camera facing the street, and compared the recordings to determine whether any unusual movement had been captured at the exact moment Michael Turner vanished. Most of the footage revealed nothing more than the calm routine of a suburban morning. A jogger appeared briefly on one camera before turning the corner at the end of the street. A delivery van passed through the neighborhood several minutes later. None of these recordings explained what happened in the few seconds after Michael reached his mailbox. But as detectives continued reviewing the recordings, they noticed something that caused them to pause. One of the houses located a short distance down the street belonged to Ryan Mitchell, the quiet neighbor who had moved into the area 6 months earlier. Cameras mounted on Ryan Mitchell's property faced several different angles of Oakridge Lane, including portions of the sidewalk and nearby driveways. When investigators realized that those cameras might have captured additional footage from the exact moment Michael disappeared, they decided to examine the recordings from that house more closely. And as detectives prepared to take a closer look at Ryan Mitchell's security system, they began to suspect that the quiet neighbor living only a few houses away might be connected to a discovery that would leave investigators deeply unsettled. As the search for Michael Turner stretched into its second week, investigators began shifting their focus from the surrounding woods and open land back toward the neighborhood itself. Detectives reviewing security footage noticed that one property on Oakridge Lane had a far more extensive camera system than any other house on the street. The home belonged to Ryan Mitchell, the quiet neighbor who had moved in 6 months before Michael disappeared. Mounted along the edges of Ryan's roofline were multiple security cameras positioned to monitor the driveway, the street, and even sections of neighboring yards. When officers counted them, they identified 9 separate cameras covering different angles around the property. For investigators, that discovery initially seemed promising. With so many cameras pointed toward the road and surrounding homes, there was a strong chance that Ryan Mitchell's system had captured something the other cameras had missed. Detectives approached Ryan and explained that they were gathering every available recording from the morning Michael Turner vanished. Ryan listened calmly and repeated the same explanation he had given during their first conversation. He told officers that he had not seen anything unusual that morning and had no information about where Michael might have gone. When investigators asked if they could review the recordings from his cameras, Ryan agreed without hesitation. Yet what detectives discovered when they examined the system raised a series of new questions that no one in the neighborhood had expected. According to the digital logs stored within Ryan Mitchell's security system, every camera mounted on his house had been turned off during the exact window of time when Michael Turner disappeared. The shutdown began shortly before 6:30 that morning and lasted until almost 7 o'clock. For roughly 30 minutes, the 9 cameras surrounding Ryan's property recorded nothing at all. Detectives found the timing difficult to ignore. Michael Turner stepped outside his home at approximately 6:42, the same period when Ryan's cameras were inactive. When investigators asked Ryan about the gap in the recordings, he explained that he had powered down the system while adjusting the network connected to the cameras. According to his statement, he had recently experienced technical issues with the recording software and wanted to restart the equipment. The explanation was possible, but the timing felt remarkably convenient. If Ryan Mitchell's cameras had been operating normally that morning, they might have captured one of the clearest views of Michael Turner's driveway at the moment he vanished. Instead, the one system capable of providing that perspective had gone dark for the exact stretch of time investigators needed most. For detectives studying the timeline of events, the coincidence was impossible to ignore. Because of those circumstances, investigators decided to examine Ryan Mitchell's property more closely. After gathering enough information to justify a search warrant, officers returned to the house and began inspecting the interior rooms, hoping to uncover anything that might explain why his cameras had been shut down at such a critical moment. The search led them into the basement, a space that appeared organized yet strangely focused on the neighborhood surrounding Oakridge Lane. On one wall, investigators discovered a large map of the area, showing detailed markings around several streets and houses. Nearby shelves held printed photographs of different homes along Oakridge Lane, each labeled with small notes written in careful handwriting. Some photographs showed driveways, others showed front yards or sidewalks leading to mailboxes. On a work table in the center of the room, detectives found a thick notebook filled with observations recorded over several months. The entries described daily routines of people living nearby, including the times when residents left for work or returned home in the evening. When detectives turned several pages into the notebook, they encountered a line that immediately caught their attention. Written beside a small sketch of Michael Turner's driveway was a brief note that read, "6:40 routine confirmed." For investigators who had already learned how consistent Michael's morning habit had been, the message suggested that someone had been watching that routine closely. The discovery in Ryan Mitchell's basement raised serious concerns among the detectives working the case. The photographs and notes seemed to indicate that Ryan had been studying the patterns of daily life on Oakridge Lane for months before Michael Turner disappeared. Investigators carefully collected the notebook and other materials, hoping forensic testing might reveal additional clues. Specialists examined the photographs, the pages of the notebook, and the surfaces of the work table where the items had been stored. They searched for fingerprints, traces of fibers, or any physical evidence that could link Ryan Mitchell directly to the disappearance. Yet despite the unsettling nature of what they found in the basement, the forensic results produced no clear answers. DNA samples taken from the notebook and surrounding objects revealed nothing connecting Ryan Mitchell to Michael Turner's home or personal belongings. Fingerprint comparisons did not match anything found inside Michael's house or near the mailbox where he was last seen. The evidence suggested that Ryan Mitchell had been observing the neighborhood, but it did not prove that he had taken part in Michael Turner's disappearance. Without a direct connection tying him to the event itself, detectives faced a difficult reality. Suspicion alone was not enough to support criminal charges. In the weeks that followed, investigators continued questioning Ryan Mitchell while reviewing every detail of his background. Records showed that he had moved between several states over the years, often working short-term technical jobs before relocating again. None of those details placed him at the center of a known crime. When detectives confronted him with the notebook entries describing the routines of neighbors, Ryan explained that he had been documenting activity around the neighborhood as part of a personal interest in security and surveillance systems. He claimed the notes were simply observations intended to help him understand the patterns of daily life around his home. Although the explanation sounded unusual, it was not illegal. Without evidence placing him at the scene when Michael Turner vanished, investigators were forced to release Ryan Mitchell and continue searching for other leads. For the residents of Oakridge Lane, the development was deeply unsettling. The discovery of the basement materials suggested that someone had been watching their routines far more closely than anyone realized. Yet the investigation had produced no proof that the observer had committed a crime. Ryan Mitchell returned to his quiet life in the same house next door, while detectives struggled to find a path forward in a case that seemed to resist every attempt to solve it. Months passed without a single confirmed sighting of Michael Turner. Search efforts gradually slowed as investigators exhausted every immediate lead available to them. Flyers bearing Michael's photograph appeared on community bulletin boards and along nearby streets, but no new information arrived from the public. His employer eventually replaced him at the accounting firm after weeks of absence, and neighbors on Oakridge Lane slowly returned to their daily routines while carrying the quiet awareness that something deeply unusual had occurred on their street. The driveway where Michael Turner had last been seen became a silent reminder of the unanswered questions surrounding his disappearance. Detectives continued reviewing the case files from time to time, hoping that a small, overlooked detail might reveal itself. But as the months stretched toward a full year without progress, the investigation gradually faded from public attention. Michael Turner's disappearance became one of the town's most puzzling unsolved mysteries, a case discussed occasionally by residents who still wondered how a man could vanish during a simple walk to the mailbox. Nearly a year after the morning Michael Turner disappeared, the quiet neighborhood of Oakridge Lane experienced an unexpected development that would reopen the investigation in a way no one had anticipated. A construction crew working on repairs to a drainage system near the edge of the neighborhood began digging beneath a section of ground that had remained undisturbed for decades. At first, the work seemed routine, part of a municipal project designed to improve water flow during heavy storms. But during the excavation, one of the workers noticed something unusual buried beneath the soil. The discovery forced the crew to stop their equipment and contact local authorities immediately. Within hours, police officers returned to the area to examine what had been uncovered. And as investigators looked closer at the object emerging from beneath the ground, they realized that the quiet street where Michael Turner vanished might be hiding a secret that had remained buried for months beneath the neighborhood itself. Nearly a year after Michael Turner vanished from the end of his driveway, the quiet investigation surrounding his disappearance suddenly returned to life because of an unexpected discovery. Construction workers had been assigned to repair part of the drainage system running beneath the edge of the neighborhood just beyond Oakridge Lane. The work involved removing sections of soil that had not been disturbed for many years, and at first the process appeared routine. Heavy equipment carved narrow trenches into the ground, while workers inspected aging pipes and cleared debris that had accumulated over time. But during the excavation, one worker noticed something unusual embedded within the soil several feet below the surface. It was a small metal object that appeared deliberately buried rather than accidentally lost. Curious about the discovery, the crew carefully removed the surrounding dirt until a rectangular metal lockbox came into view. The box was sealed tightly and showed signs of being placed underground months earlier. Because the object appeared out of place in the middle of a municipal drainage repair site, the workers contacted local authorities to report what they had found. Within a short time, police officers arrived and secured the area while investigators examined the box more closely. What they discovered inside would soon transform the entire direction of the case surrounding Michael Turner's disappearance. When detectives opened the metal lockbox, they found several items that immediately captured their attention. Inside were neatly stacked bundles of cash, sealed inside protective plastic. Beneath the money rested a passport bearing the name Michael Turner, along with a collection of official documents, including identification records and printed travel forms. At first, the discovery seemed almost impossible to believe. For nearly a year, investigators had searched for signs of where Michael Turner might have gone after leaving his driveway that morning. The idea that personal belongings connected to him had been buried beneath the neighborhood suggested a completely different scenario from the one detectives had originally considered. Yet the most surprising detail came when authorities examined the passport itself more closely. The document contained stamps showing recent international travel. According to the dates recorded by border authorities, the passport had been used just 2 days after Michael Turner disappeared from Oakridge Lane. Investigators immediately contacted federal travel agencies and reviewed border crossing databases to confirm the information. The results revealed something that shocked everyone involved in the case. 2 days after the morning he vanished, a man traveling under the name Michael Turner had passed through an international airport and boarded a flight leaving the United States. The discovery forced detectives to reconsider every assumption they had made about the disappearance. For months, investigators had focused on the possibility that Michael Turner had been taken against his will or harmed somewhere near his home. But the passport records suggested a different explanation entirely. If the documents were genuine, then Michael Turner had not simply vanished. Instead, he had traveled out of the country shortly after the moment he was last seen. Detectives began reviewing financial records and digital information connected to Michael's life in far greater detail than before. What they discovered revealed a hidden side of his situation that had remained concealed during the early stages of the investigation. Bank records showed that several small transfers of money had been made over the months leading up to his disappearance, moving funds from his primary account into a series of secondary accounts opened under variations of his name. None of the transfers were large enough to raise immediate suspicion, but together they represented a significant amount of money quietly relocated over time. Investigators also uncovered records indicating that Michael had purchased travel-related services months earlier using prepaid payment methods that were difficult to trace. When detectives assembled these details alongside the passport stamps, the picture became clearer. Further examination of Michael Turner's financial history uncovered another troubling detail. Over the previous year, he had accumulated significant gambling losses through online betting platforms and casino visits recorded in nearby cities. The debts connected to those activities had grown steadily, eventually reaching a level that placed severe pressure on his finances. Records indicated that he had attempted to secure loans from several sources before his disappearance, suggesting that he had been struggling to cover those obligations. When detectives combined that information with the hidden bank transfers and travel preparations, the investigation began pointing toward a conclusion few neighbors had imagined during the early days of the search. Michael Turner had likely been planning something for months before the morning he walked to his mailbox. The quiet routines that residents of Oakridge Lane observed each day may have concealed a far more complicated situation unfolding behind the closed doors of his home. Investigators soon realized that the discovery of the buried lockbox provided an important clue about how the plan may have worked. By hiding the passport and cash underground near the drainage area, Michael Turner may have created a temporary storage location that allowed him to leave his house that morning without carrying anything that would attract attention. If he retrieved the box shortly after stepping outside, he could have accessed the money and documents needed to travel without returning to his home. That theory also explained why his phone, wallet, and car remained behind in the house. Leaving those items behind would make the disappearance appear sudden and mysterious, encouraging investigators to believe he had been taken unexpectedly. With his identification and travel funds hidden nearby, Michael would have been free to move quickly toward a transportation route outside the neighborhood. The brief interruption captured by the security camera may have occurred at the exact moment he stepped out of view to retrieve the lockbox and leave the street without being noticed. As the investigation progressed, detectives concluded that Michael Turner had not been abducted or attacked on Oakridge Lane. Instead, the evidence suggested that he had carefully arranged the circumstances of his own disappearance. The quiet man who followed the same morning routine every day had apparently spent months preparing a way to leave his life behind without warning. His financial struggles, hidden accounts, and travel arrangements formed a pattern that pointed toward deliberate planning rather than sudden danger. By the time neighbors and police realized he was missing, Michael Turner had already crossed international borders and disappeared into a new identity somewhere beyond the reach of the investigation. The discovery of the buried lockbox confirmed that the mystery of Oakridge Lane had never been about a violent crime committed in the shadows of the neighborhood. It had been about a man quietly constructing an escape route while continuing to appear exactly the same as he always had. And in the end, the calm routine that once defined Michael Turner's life had helped him execute a plan that allowed him to vanish almost completely. The discovery that Michael Turner had likely staged his disappearance answered many of the questions investigators had struggled with for months, but it did not close the case as neatly as some people expected. In fact, the deeper detectives looked into the events surrounding October 14th, the more they realized that one piece of the story still did not fully make sense. If Michael Turner had been planning his escape for months, someone else had apparently been watching him just as carefully. That realization brought investigators back to the quiet house 2 doors away, the home belonging to Ryan Mitchell. During the early stages of the investigation, Ryan had drawn attention because of the surveillance equipment mounted around his property and the strange notebook discovered in his basement. At the time, those details suggested he might have been involved in Michael Turner's disappearance. Yet as detectives continued examining Ryan Mitchell's background after the discovery of the buried lockbox, they uncovered information that shifted the entire perspective on his role in the story. Records obtained during the investigation revealed that Ryan Mitchell was not simply a quiet resident who had developed an unusual interest in observing his neighbors. In reality, Ryan Mitchell had been working as a licensed private investigator before moving into the house on Oakridge Lane. Financial documents and communications uncovered by detectives showed that he had been hired months earlier by a group of creditors attempting to locate Michael Turner. Those creditors had grown concerned after Michael accumulated significant gambling debts and began missing scheduled payments. According to the documents investigators reviewed, the creditors suspected that Michael Turner might eventually attempt to disappear in order to escape the financial obligations he could no longer manage. Ryan Mitchell's assignment had been straightforward: move close enough to observe Michael Turner's daily routine and gather information about his movements so the creditors could confront him before he had the chance to vanish. The notes discovered in Ryan Mitchell's basement suddenly made much more sense in light of that revelation. The photographs of houses along Oakridge Lane and the entries describing daily routines were not random observations after all. They were part of a surveillance effort designed to track the habits of the man living next door. The entry that read 6:40 routine confirmed reflected Ryan's attempt to document the precise time Michael Turner left his house each morning. By observing the neighborhood from his porch and monitoring the street with security cameras, Ryan had been quietly building a record of Michael's movements for months. Investigators eventually concluded that Ryan Mitchell had likely been waiting for the right moment to confront Michael Turner about the mounting debts that had drawn the attention of those creditors in the first place. What Ryan did not expect was that Michael Turner was planning something far more elaborate than simply missing a payment. On the morning of October 14th, Ryan Mitchell had reportedly noticed Michael stepping outside, just as he had countless times before. According to the timeline detectives reconstructed later, Ryan had briefly shut down his camera system to restart the network, a routine technical adjustment he claimed to perform occasionally. During those same minutes, Michael Turner walked down his driveway toward the mailbox. By the time Ryan Mitchell's cameras were operating again, Michael had already disappeared from view. Investigators eventually concluded that Ryan had lost sight of him during the exact window of time when Michael retrieved the buried lockbox and left the neighborhood. The private investigator who had spent months studying Michael Turner's habits had come within seconds of witnessing the escape he had been hired to prevent. Yet those few seconds were all it took for Michael Turner to slip away completely. When detectives informed Ryan Mitchell about the passport records and financial evidence indicating that Michael had left the country, the revelation reportedly left him stunned. The surveillance effort he had conducted for months had been focused on the assumption that Michael might attempt to flee at some point in the future. What Ryan had not anticipated was that the plan was already underway. By the time anyone realized what had happened, Michael Turner had likely been far beyond the reach of the neighborhood where he once lived. Authorities shared the travel information with international agencies and attempted to trace any additional activity connected to Michael's identity. But after the initial flight that carried him out of the United States, the trail grew faint. The documents he had prepared months earlier may have allowed him to adopt a new identity or continue traveling under different records. Without confirmed sightings or additional financial activity tied directly to his name, investigators found themselves facing the same frustrating conclusion that had defined the case from the beginning. Years later, the house on Oakridge Lane where Michael Turner once lived has long since been occupied by new residents who know the story only as something they heard from neighbors after moving in. The mailbox at the end of the driveway still stands in the same place where Michael was last seen that morning. For the people who lived through the investigation, however, the memory of the disappearance remains difficult to forget. They remember the police cars parked along the curb, the search teams walking through nearby fields, and the strange realization that one of their neighbors had quietly been watching the street while another had been planning his escape from it. The quiet suburban routine that once seemed so simple turned out to conceal a complicated chain of events involving debt, surveillance, and a carefully timed disappearance. To this day, no confirmed record has revealed where Michael Turner ultimately went after leaving the country. Investigators believe he prepared the escape well enough to ensure that his trail would fade quickly once he crossed international borders. For the creditors who hired Ryan Mitchell to track him, the outcome was as frustrating as it was unexpected. The man they hoped to confront about his debts vanished before they had the opportunity to stop him. And for the residents of Oakridge Lane, the mystery of the neighbor who disappeared during a short walk to the mailbox continues to linger quietly in memory, a reminder that even the most ordinary routines can sometimes hide plans that no one around us ever sees coming. The street where Michael Turner once lived looks almost exactly the same today as it did on the morning he vanished. Oakridge Lane remains quiet, with the same rows of houses, the same trees casting long shadows across the pavement, and the same mailbox standing at the end of the driveway where the mystery began. New families have moved into some of the homes, children still ride their bicycles along the sidewalks, and life continues with the calm rhythm that once defined the neighborhood. Yet for those who remember the investigation, that quiet street carries a story that still raises questions years later. Michael Turner stepped outside his home on a calm morning, walked a short distance toward his mailbox, and disappeared in a way that left investigators searching for answers for months. At first it appeared to be an unexplained disappearance that might involve danger or foul play. But as the evidence slowly emerged, the truth revealed something far more unusual. The quiet accountant who seemed to live such a steady life had been preparing for an escape long before anyone realized what he was planning. By the time investigators pieced together the details, Michael Turner had already crossed international borders and left the life he once lived on Oakridge Lane behind him. So the real question remains: Was Michael Turner simply a desperate man trying to escape the pressure of growing debt and financial mistakes? Or was he something else entirely? A careful planner who designed the perfect disappearance while maintaining the appearance of an ordinary routine? The answer may never be fully known. The buried lockbox, the hidden bank accounts, and the months of quiet preparation all suggest a plan that unfolded exactly as he intended. Yet the mystery still lingers because no one has ever confirmed where Michael Turner went after leaving the country. Somewhere beyond that quiet neighborhood, the man who once followed the same morning routine every day may still be living under a different identity, far removed from the driveway where the investigation began. Now the story turns to you. After hearing everything investigators uncovered about Michael Turner's disappearance, what do you believe really happened that morning on Oakridge Lane? Do you think he simply escaped at the right moment? Or do you believe there could still be details about his plan that no one has discovered? Share your thoughts in the comments below because your perspective might raise questions others have not considered. And if you enjoy real mysteries like this, stories where ordinary moments lead to extraordinary events, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more true stories that remind us that reality can sometimes be far more surprising than fiction.